In the heart of West Africa, where the dust of the Sahel meets the promise of the rising sun, a quiet revolution has begun, one not forged by weapons or rebellion, but by conviction, courage, and the undeniable will of a people determined to reclaim their destiny. Burkina Faso, a land once dismissed as one of the world's poorest nations, now stands at the crossroads of history, leading a wave of change that challenges centuries of dependency, exploitation, and silence. This story is not merely about politics or economics. It is about identity, dignity, and the rediscovery of power that was always there, waiting beneath the surface of oppression. For decades, Africa's narrative was written by others, colonizers, corporations, and global institutions that saw the continent not as a partner, but as a resource. But as the winds shift and the voices of the young rise with clarity and strength, a new chapter is being written, one by Africans for Africa. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, this transformation found its symbol in the bold declaration of the Headquarters Law, a legislative step that stunned the world and reignited the spirit of Pan-African unity. It was more than just legal text. It was a message to every African nation that sovereignty could no longer be negotiated, that dignity was not for sale, and that a nation's future must never again be dictated from outside its borders. To understand the magnitude of this decision, one must first grasp the long shadow of exploitation that shaped the African continent. For centuries, from the colonial empires to the modern era of globalization, Africa's wealth flowed outward, its gold, oil, uranium, and human potential extracted in the name of progress. But progress for whom? Villages were stripped of their youth, economies designed not to serve the people but to feed distant capitals, and generations taught that their salvation lay in foreign aid rather than self-reliance. Yet, amid this long night of subjugation, there were always sparks. Leaders who dreamed of liberation not just from physical occupation, but from mental dependency. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary son of Burkina Faso, once declared that he who feeds you controls you, a truth that resonates even louder today as nations awaken to the cost of borrowed help and conditional partnerships. His spirit, long thought extinguished, seems to have found its echo in the hearts of the people once more, as Burkina Faso and its allies, Mali and Niger, stand united under the banner of self-determination. The Headquarters Law is the embodiment of that spirit, a refusal to accept the presence of foreign military bases that claim to protect but often control, a rejection of economic policies that enrich the few while impoverishing the many, and a reclaiming of national destiny in a world that too often seeks to dictate it. The law states simply but powerfully, any foreign entity wishing to establish headquarters or operate within the territory of Burkina Faso must now do so under the full authority, regulation, and partnership of the Burkinabe people. No more hidden contracts. No more one-sided deals. No more invisible hands steering the future from boardrooms thousands of miles away. For the first time in decades, the terms of engagement have changed, and the world has been forced to listen. In villages and cities alike, from Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso, there is a new sense of pride, a feeling that the sacrifices of those who fought for independence are finally bearing fruit. Youths march in the streets, not with anger, but with purpose. Elders speak of the old days when Africa stood united in dream, and how that dream might live again. Across social media, across the continent, and across the diaspora, the message spreads: Africa is awakening. Yet, with every step toward freedom comes resistance. Those who have long benefited from Africa's silence are not eager to see it rise. Sanctions, threats, misinformation campaigns, these are the new weapons of control. But as the Burkinabe government and its people have shown, fear no longer governs their choices. They have seen too much, endured too much, and waited too long. The law, in essence, is not just a piece of governance. It is a declaration of rebirth. It challenges every African leader to look within and ask, who truly governs our land? Who writes our policies? Who profits from our labor? And perhaps most importantly, who tells our story? For when a nation begins to answer these questions honestly, it begins to free itself from invisible chains stronger than steel, the chains of dependence and doubt. This is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is the story of an entire continent rediscovering its voice after centuries of being silenced. It is about the young engineer in Lagos dreaming of building his own tech company without needing foreign validation, the farmer in Ghana demanding fair trade for his cocoa, the teacher in Dakar explaining to her students that their history did not begin with colonization, but with empires that lit the world with science, art, and philosophy. The headquarters law, though administrative on paper, has become symbolic in practice, a rallying cry for every African nation to redefine what sovereignty means in the 21st century. It is not isolationism. It is self-respect. It is not defiance. It is clarity. It is the understanding that cooperation must be built on equality, not subservience. For too long, Africa has been seen as the world's testing ground, a place where others come to extract, experiment, and exploit. But now, as Burkina Faso takes the lead, a different image begins to form. An Africa that negotiates on its own terms, that values its people and potential, that recognizes the immense power of unity. Imagine a continent where resources fund education instead of debt payments, where innovation flows from local minds instead of imported blueprints, where the youth do not flee in search of opportunity because opportunity thrives at home. That vision is what the headquarters law dares to protect. The belief that Africa's rebirth is not a dream, but an inevitability. Every movement begins with a single act of courage, and this law is precisely that, a defiant, unapologetic statement of ownership over destiny. As night falls over Ouagadougou, the city hums with both uncertainty and hope. The air feels charged, as if the ancestors themselves are whispering through the wind, reminding their descendants that history does not end with suffering. It begins anew with resistance. The world may not yet understand the full gravity of what is unfolding here, but those who know Africa's heartbeat can feel it. Something monumental has shifted. A seed has been planted, and though storms may come, it will grow, because it was sown in truth. Burkina Faso's decision is not the end of a struggle, but the dawn of a movement, one that will inspire generations to come, not with slogans or speeches, but with the living example of what it means to stand tall, even when standing alone. And as the snow falls on distant continents and the sun rises again over the Sahel, one truth will remain undeniable. The age of silence is over, and Africa has begun to speak once more in its own voice, with its own strength. For its own people, as the echoes of Burkina Faso's declaration rippled across the continent, a quiet yet undeniable momentum began to stir, one that could no longer be contained within borders or silenced by diplomacy. From Bamako to Niamey, from Accra to Addis Ababa, conversations began to shift, carrying the weight of long-buried questions of justice, ownership, and identity. The world had watched Africa for centuries, but perhaps for the first time, Africa was beginning to watch itself, not through the distorted lens of foreign commentary, but through its own reflection. In Mali, soldiers stood at attention as their leaders addressed the nation, affirming their solidarity with Burkina Faso and Niger in forming a new alliance grounded not in dependency, but in self-determination. It was called the Alliance of Sahel States, but its significance stretched far beyond the desert sands. It was a message of unity, a defiance of the narrative that African nations must always act alone, compete, or be divided by invisible lines drawn long ago by colonial rulers. Together, they stood as a wall against external interference, declaring that the age of foreign domination, military, political, and economic, was no longer tolerable. The air across West Africa grew thick with both hope and apprehension. In markets, people debated what independence truly meant in a modern world bound by trade and global finance. In classrooms, teachers drew new maps of Africa, not those that showed colonial divisions, but those that revealed potential, resource networks, cultural ties, and ancient trade routes that had once connected kingdoms from the Atlantic to the Nile. The youth, too, began to awaken to their role in this rebirth, recognizing that freedom was not only about borders, but about minds. They saw in Burkina Faso's defiance a mirror of their own frustration, a desire to be the architects of their own future rather than the subjects of someone else's design. In Niamey, Niger's capital, the government made a decision equally bold to reclaim its uranium industry from foreign control. For decades, Niger had provided much of the uranium that powered European cities, yet its own people lived in darkness. This contradiction had long been accepted as the natural order of things, until now. The announcement sent shockwaves through financial markets, but for the people of Niger, it felt like justice long overdue. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, singing, chanting words that resonated with pride. For the first time, we are rich in our own eyes. Across Africa, similar sentiments began to rise. Leaders who had once walked cautiously around global powers began to speak more openly about reform, accountability, and sovereignty. Even in distant capitals, whispers grew louder. What if Africa was truly awakening? What if the balance of power was shifting, not through war or rebellion, but through the steady, disciplined assertion of dignity? Yet every revolution, even one of the spirit, invites resistance. As Africa began to reclaim its narrative, the world's most powerful institutions watched uneasily. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and economic threats began to unfold like a familiar playbook. Analysts on international news channels framed the movement as reckless, anti-Western, or dangerously nationalistic. But to those within the continent, this was not about hatred or revenge. It was about survival, about rewriting a story that had been misinterpreted for far too long. To understand the depth of this transformation, one must look beyond politics to the human stories driving it. In a small Burkinabe village, an old woman named Awa sat beneath a baobab tree, telling her grandchildren about Thomas Sankara, the man who planted trees and dreams. "He said we could feed ourselves," she whispered, her voice trembling with both pride and pain. And now, his children are doing just that. 1,000 miles away, in a Lagos startup hub, a group of young entrepreneurs designed apps that connected local farmers directly to consumers, bypassing middlemen who had once drained their profits. In Ghana, artists painted murals of unity and resistance, while in Senegal, poets spoke of a new dawn for Africa, a dawn written not in foreign tongues, but in native rhythms. The movement was not centralized. It had no single leader. Instead, it thrived through shared consciousness, through the unspoken understanding that Africa could no longer afford to forget its worth. And yet, amid this growing pride, there were challenges, internal and external. Corruption, tribal tensions, and the scars of civil conflict remained, haunting the edges of this awakening like ghosts unwilling to release their grip. The question was not whether Africa could rise, but whether it could rise together. History had shown that unity was Africa's greatest strength and also its greatest vulnerability, for division was the easiest weapon against it. But perhaps this time was different. Perhaps the lessons of the past had finally taken root. The headquarters law in Burkina Faso became a blueprint for policy thinkers across the continent. Legal scholars in Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia began drafting similar frameworks, exploring ways to reclaim local authority over foreign corporations and NGOs. The African Union, long criticized for its cautious diplomacy, faced renewed pressure to evolve from a form of words into a force of action. Could it become the collective voice of a continent ready to redefine itself? In Addis Ababa, a young policy advisor named Sagaye argued in a televised debate, "Sovereignty is not isolation. It is participation on our own terms." His words echoed through social media, capturing the essence of this generational movement: confidence without arrogance, power without exploitation. For too long, Africa had been told that progress required imitation, imitating Western democracy, Western economics, Western education. But the youth were beginning to realize that imitation is the enemy of innovation. They no longer sought to copy the world. They sought to contribute to it authentically. In universities across Africa, students revisited forgotten histories, empires like Mali, Songhai, and Benin, discovering that their ancestors had mastered trade, astronomy, and governance long before colonization. The idea that Africa needed saving began to crumble, replaced by the realization that Africa had always possessed the tools to save itself. What it lacked was permission, and now it no longer asked for it. Still, the struggle for self-definition was not without cost. The international community responded with calculated restraint, offering aid with strings attached, funding opposition movements, and amplifying voices of dissent to fracture the unity taking shape. Yet for every challenge imposed, Africa found a way to adapt. In rural Burkina Faso, local cooperatives began pooling resources to support farmers affected by sanctions. In Mali, military engineers turned to regional partnerships for defense technology. In Niger, renewable energy projects funded by diaspora contributions began to light up villages once forgotten by the national grid. Bit by bit, a self-sustaining ecosystem emerged, fragile, imperfect, but undeniably African. And perhaps that was its greatest strength: authenticity. For centuries, Africa's greatest curse had been the denial of its own originality. But now, authenticity was its weapon, its language, its light. Slowly, the rest of the world began to notice, not out of charity, but out of necessity. Global energy crises, food shortages, and climate change forced nations to reconsider Africa not as a resource pit, but as a partner in survival. The irony was undeniable. The very continent long exploited for its riches had become the key to a sustainable future. Yet Africa, wiser from centuries of exploitation, moved cautiously. It no longer rushed into contracts promising progress, but delivering debt. Instead, leaders began demanding fairness, transparency, and respect. The symbolism was everywhere. African fabrics on world stages, African languages spoken at summits, African ideas shaping climate policies. The continent was no longer hiding its identity. It was wearing it like armor. Still, beneath this growing pride was a deep humility, the awareness that the road ahead was long and that freedom must be protected daily, not celebrated once. For every child educated, every law rewritten, every resource reclaimed, there would be forces trying to undo it. But perhaps that is the nature of rebirth. It is not a single moment of triumph, but a continuous act of courage. And as the sun set over the Sahel, casting long shadows across the red earth, a quiet conviction filled the air, a belief that Africa's story, once fragmented, was finally finding its rhythm again. It was not a return to the past, but a fusion of past and future, guided by the unshakable truth that no empire, no power, no foreign policy could suppress a people who have remembered who they are. The ancestors, it seemed, were listening. The soil, long soaked in struggle, was beginning to bear fruit, and somewhere in Ouagadougou, beneath the same baobab trees that had witnessed centuries of history, a child looked up at the sky and whispered a simple truth that generations had fought to prove. Africa is rising, and this time, it will not fall. The world had changed, quietly at first, then all at once, and though few could trace the exact moment it began, many agreed that somewhere in the heart of West Africa, when Burkina Faso decided that those who profited from its soil must build upon it, history began to turn its face toward justice again. From that single act of defiance came a continental awakening that no one, not even the most powerful empires, could fully predict. In the years that followed, Africa's map did not change, but its meaning did. Borders remained, yet the invisible walls that once divided minds began to crumble. The conversation was no longer about aid, but about agency. Not charity, but cooperation. Not dependency, but destiny. Across the continent, new skylines began to rise. Not of foreign banks or imported franchises, but of African institutions, African universities, African tech firms carrying names in native tongues that once had been silenced in global boardrooms. In Nairobi, a young woman coded an app that connected villages to solar grids designed in Ghana and powered by panels manufactured in Burkina Faso. In Lagos, filmmakers told stories of strength and healing, their voices broadcast across digital platforms owned by African creators. In Kigali, engineers built drones that delivered medicine to rural hospitals, each flight a reminder that innovation did not belong to one hemisphere alone. Slowly, a continent long defined by extraction began to define itself through creation. Yet the real revolution was not in the buildings or the technology. It was in the mindset. Africa had stopped waiting for validation. No longer asking to be included, it began to invite others on its own terms. Conferences once held in London or Paris were now hosted in Accra or Addis Ababa. World leaders who once visited Africa to negotiate resources now came seeking partnerships. And when they arrived, they found something unfamiliar: confidence wrapped in humility, ambition balanced by memory. Because Africa had not forgotten. It remembered every treaty signed under duress, every promise broken in the name of progress, every generation taught to doubt its worth. But instead of revenge, it offered renewal. "We will build with you," the leaders said, "but only if you build here." The world, still reeling from crises of its own making, pandemics, wars, climate disasters, began to understand that survival was no longer about dominance, but collaboration. Suddenly, the minerals under African soil were not just commodities, they were keys to the planet's green future. The cobalt of the Congo, the lithium of Mali, the sunlight of Namibia, all became symbols of a new global order where Africa's contribution was not optional, but essential. And yet, with this power came caution. Africa knew too well how quickly opportunity could turn to exploitation. So the continent began to form its own councils, its own credit systems, its own technological standards. The African Continental Free Trade Area evolved from an economic idea into a living organism, connecting ports, highways, and data networks in ways that had once seemed impossible. For the first time, goods traveled from Cape Town to Cairo without leaving African soil. The dream of Pan-Africanism, long confined to speeches and textbooks, had become geography. But even as progress surged, Africa remained deeply aware that development without soul is just another kind of dependency. That is why, alongside its economic rise, came a cultural renaissance, a revival of languages, traditions, and philosophies once dismissed as relics of the past. Schools began to teach African history from an African point of view. Children learned of Sundiata Keita and Queen Nzinga alongside Einstein and Newton. Museums once filled with foreign curators now housed returning artifacts, masks, spears, manuscripts, pieces of identity stolen during colonization, and finally brought home. And as these treasures returned, so did pride. In Senegal, a festival celebrated ancient storytelling, blending drums with digital screens, griots with filmmakers. In South Africa, a poet declared, "We are not emerging, we are remembering." His words echoed through stadiums and across timelines, reminding the world that progress built on memory is unbreakable. The diaspora, too, began to return, not as visitors, but as bridge builders. From New York to London, from São Paulo to Paris, sons and daughters of Africa packed their bags, bringing with them experience, technology, and dreams. They came not to save Africa, but to serve it, to reconnect with roots that had waited generations to be found. In this reunion, there was healing. Healing from the wounds of displacement, healing from the shame of misrepresentation, healing from the lie that greatness must always come from elsewhere. The global perception of Africa began to shift, not because of charity campaigns or slogans, but because Africa itself was changing the narrative through undeniable results. It was now a place where innovation met tradition, where community met technology, where ancient wisdom guided modern governance. Still, challenges remained. Corruption did not vanish overnight. Greed did not evaporate. Storms still ravaged crops. Conflicts still threatened peace. But what had changed was the collective response. When floods hit Mozambique, neighbors from Zambia and Tanzania sent help within hours. No need to wait for distant relief agencies. When famine threatened parts of the Sahel, farmers from Ghana shared hybrid seeds developed by African scientists. A network of compassion had formed, one that recognized that Africa's strength was not in its size or its resources, but in its solidarity. The world took notice. Documentaries began calling it the African Century, but those within the continent knew it was something deeper. It was a reawakening of identity. Universities in Europe and America added new courses titled The African Model of Development, analyzing how community-based economics could solve global inequality. CEOs from Asia and Europe relocated their regional offices to African capitals, not because they were forced to, but because that was where growth lived. And somewhere amid this transformation, a quiet truth settled in. Africa had never been the dark continent. It had been the dimmed one, its light covered, not lost. Now that light burned brighter than ever. In Ouagadougou, where it had all begun, the first skyline of headquarters stood tall, gleaming against the desert sun. Each tower bore names of local architects, local engineers, local visionaries. Beneath those buildings, markets thrived, schools expanded, and the hum of progress filled the air. But if you listened closely, beneath the noise of engines and construction, you could still hear the sound of drums, the same rhythms that once guided kingdoms, now echoing through modern streets. Because progress, Africa had learned, was not about replacing the past, but remixing it. It was not about becoming someone else, but becoming more of itself. On the 15th anniversary of the headquarters law, a ceremony was held at the base of the tallest building in Burkina Faso. Leaders from across the continent gathered, presidents, ministers, artists, scholars, all standing beneath a flag that represented not just a nation, but a movement. The president took the podium, her voice steady and clear. "Years ago, we asked the world to build with us, not above us. Today, the world stands beside us. Our children will inherit not just land, but purpose. The crowd erupted, not in the frenzy of victory, but in the calm recognition of arrival. And somewhere in that crowd, an old woman named Awa, the same who once told stories under a baobab tree, smiled through her wrinkles. She whispered to her granddaughter, "You see, child, the seeds Sankara planted have become forests." The child nodded, holding her grandmother's hand as fireworks painted the night sky. For a brief moment, time folded in on itself. Past, present, and future intertwined in one collective heartbeat. And as the lights shimmered above, Africa stood tall, not as a continent seeking acceptance, but as a civilization offering direction. To the world now looking toward it, Africa had one message: we are not your story to tell. We are your story to learn from. The world's oldest cradle had become its newest compass. And as dawn broke over the red horizon, with golden rays kissing the land that had endured so much, a new era began. One where the world finally understood that when Africa rises, humanity rises with it.